Before he became a terror on the wind, before his voice could split stone and unman the hearts of kings, the Witch-King of Angmar was a man. That is the part most forget. He was not born in shadow. He did not crawl from some ancient crypt, nor rise from the fires of Mordor fully formed. He was born into sunlight, a child of glory in a time when men still walked tall among the children of Eru. If ever there was a mortal who seemed beyond the reach of darkness, it was him, a son of Númenor. Imagine it, an island paradise shaped by the Valar themselves, a land where the sea met golden fields, where marble towers kissed the sky, and knowledge flowed like water from white stone fountains. The Númenóreans were not like other men. They lived long, loved deeply, and learned with a hunger only the wise could envy. And among them there rose the great houses, lineages blessed with not only strength, but with pride and ambition. From one of these houses, our unnamed lord drew his first breath. The records do not speak his name. Tolkien never told us, but perhaps it is better that way, because this tale, like so many of Middle-earth, is not about a single man. It is about the choices he made and what they made of him. He would have grown up beneath the reign of Queen Tar-Telperion, during the waning years of Númenor's early splendor. It was a strange time. The island was still mighty, but it had begun to turn inward. Whispers filled the halls, whispers of death, of fading glory, of why the Eldar across the sea were allowed eternal life, while men, even mighty Númenóreans, still withered and died. And these whispers took root, not among the weak, but among the great. Our Lord, let us call him that, for we know he was mighty, would have been raised on tales of Elendil, of the friendship with Gil-galad, of the triumphs in Middle-earth when Númenor's banners flew high. He likely stood at the prow of a black-sailed ship, golden helm shining in the sun, watching the coasts of Middle-earth grow larger on the horizon. But by then, the voyages were not made for friendship, not anymore. By the year SA 1800, the Númenóreans had changed. They no longer came bearing gifts. They came in iron, in fire. They hunted the men of Middle-earth like beasts, slew them, enslaved them, and raised temples where blood was spilled in the name of fearsome gods. And our unnamed lord, proud, cunning, powerful, would have stood at the heart of it. This was the second seed. The first was discontent. The second was dominion. And perhaps even then, long before the Nine were ever forged, he had already begun to seek power not granted by the Valar. Perhaps he had already begun to whisper into the dark. Not yet a sorcerer, no. But something in him stirred. A fascination, a pull, a need to master the unseen, to twist it, to command it. In Tolkien's writings, we are told that the 9 rings were not given to the innocent. The men who received them were already wicked, already ambitious, already powerful. So we must imagine this man not as a noble corrupted by an accident of fate. He was already walking toward the abyss. He just hadn't yet stepped over the edge. That edge would come later, when the gifts of Sauron, golden, gleaming, beautiful, were laid before him, and he reached for one without hesitation. But for now, he walked among the living. He felt the sea spray on his face. He tasted wine and honey. He heard music in the courts of kings. And he believed, as many men do, that greatness could outpace the grave. If the story moves you, if the fall of this once great lord calls to something deeper in your own soul, a curiosity perhaps, or a warning, then you are among kindred. Here, at Realms Unravelled, we seek not just to recount legend, but to walk through it, word by word, until it becomes real again. consider subscribing and walk with us through the long twilight of Middle-earth. For in the next chapter, we shall see what happens when the Lord of Gifts arrives, cloaked not in shadow, but in starlight, and offers men the one thing they were never meant to hold, not power, but permanence. Chapter 2. The Lord of Gifts. The man who would become the Witch King did not fall in a single moment. His descent was slow, like the fading of stars before the break of dawn, quiet, almost imperceptible, until it was far too late. And it began, as many tragedies do, with a promise. Not a threat, not a battle, a promise. It came in the form of a man, or what seemed to be one, fair of face, soft of voice, wise beyond reckoning. He called himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, and when he came to the elves of a region, bearing the secrets of craft and lore, he was welcomed as a friend. For the elves longed not for power or conquest, but for preservation, a way to hold back the decay of time, to shield beauty from the wear of the world. Annatar gave them what they craved, but Annatar was Sauron, and everything he gave to take. Over 3 centuries, Sauron taught the Gwaith y Myrdain, the brotherhood of jewel smiths, to forge what no hand had wrought before. And under his guidance, they shaped the rings of power. Beautiful, potent, crafted not with brute force, but with subtlety and insight. The elves forged them to preserve, to heal, to protect. Sauron, in secret, forged the one to rule. In the fires of Mount Doom, he poured into it his malice, his ambition, and a portion of his very soul. The One Ring was not just a tool, it was a tether, a chain forged of will and magic, made to bind all others to its master's dominion. And when he placed it upon his finger, he saw into the hearts of those who bore the lesser rings. But the elves were not so easily broken. Their perception, keen and ancient, allowed them to sense the sudden shift. They knew at once that Annatar was no friend. They removed their rings before his power could pierce them, and in that act of defiance, they shattered his design. Sauron's wrath burned hotter than the fires that forged his ring. He marched on a region with armies drawn from the blackest corners of Middle-earth. In the year 1697, the land of the jewel smiths was reduced to ash. Celebrimbor, their leader, was slain, pierced with arrows and strung upon the gates of his own city like a banner of despair. But Sauron was not empty-handed. Though the elves had hidden their 3 greatest rings, Vilya, Nenya, and Narya, the others fell into his grasp. Rings meant for men. Rings crafted by hands that had not foreseen the weight of their gift. And it is here, with deliberate cruelty, that Sauron scattered the seeds of his next harvest. He gave 9 to men. Why men? Because they were the easiest to corrupt. Men lacked the clarity of the elves, the resilience of the dwarves. They were creatures of passion and ambition, haunted by the shadow of mortality. And in the Rings of Power, Sauron gave them a false answer to their greatest fear: longevity, influence, dominion. Among those 9 was the man whose path we now follow. He did not stumble upon the ring, he accepted it, perhaps even coveted it. By the time it was placed into his hand, he was already powerful, perhaps a conqueror of eastern lands, or a priest-lord in the wilds of Middle-earth's frontiers. He would have been a man other men feared. But Sauron saw deeper. He saw the emptiness behind the eyes, the hunger, the longing to live beyond death, not just in memory, but in flesh. The ring answered that hunger. At first it would have seemed a blessing. His life stretched, his influence deepened. He saw further, dreamed louder, commanded more. And the others, those weaker lords, those lesser kings, followed suit. They rose like giants. Their kingdoms grew fat and golden. But unseen by mortal eyes, something within them had begun to wither. Because the ring does not give without taking. It preserves, yes, but it also possesses. And the longer they wore their rings, the more they were bound. Their bodies endured, their spirits faded, and in time, they ceased to be men. The man who would become the Witch King was not yet a wraith, but the change had begun. His dreams became more vivid, his grip on reality loosened. He could command fear with a glance, hear voices in the dark that no others could hear. The ring had begun its work, and Sauron waited. For he knew, as surely as a hunter knows the path of his prey, that sooner or later every one of the nine would kneel. If you've made it this far, you're not just a listener. You are a seeker, a keeper of hidden knowledge. Realms Unravelled is made for minds like yours. Consider subscribing so that this story and others like it can continue to rise from the shadows. For in Chapter 3, we will cross the veil and witness the final transformation, not of a man into a wraith, but of a soul into a weapon. Chapter 3. The Fading. The man was still there for a time. He walked among his people, spoke in councils, rode at the head of armies, and yet something in him was changing, slowly, quietly, like the sun slipping behind the mountains. His hand, once warm, now felt cold to the touch. His eyes, once fierce with life, held a distant gleam, as if seeing things no others could perceive. He spoke less often, and when he did, his words echoed strange and deep, as though spoken from a place not entirely of this world. Those who served him began to fear him, not for his wrath, but for his silence, his stillness. His presence, which once inspired awe, now unsettled even the most loyal. This was the fading, and it had begun the moment he accepted the ring. The rings of power did not kill. They did not maim. They offered no obvious punishment. Instead, they whispered, they twisted, they stretched. And that was the true cruelty. He still looked like a man, but he no longer felt like one. Dreams came, more vivid than waking life. In them, he stood at the edge of unseen worlds. Sometimes he saw himself clad in silver, crowned with flame. Other times, he wandered through halls without end, where voices whispered promises of endless rule and secrets buried deep in time. But always, behind it all, was one will, Sauron. The One Ring, though far away, called to the Nine, and through it, the Dark Lord's voice coiled through the lesser rings like smoke. He did not shout, he did not command, he simply waited, patient, inevitable. And the man listened, not because he was weak, but because the line between desire and duty had become too thin to see. He began to crave the spectral realm, not the light of day, but the clarity of the unseen. He could feel when death approached others. He could bend the will of men without raising a hand. His soul grew sharper, more focused, even as it drifted further from his flesh. And then the moment came, quiet, like a breath drawn in the dark. He passed beyond. It is said by Tolkien that, sooner or later, according to their native strength, and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the domination of the One. For our man, whose will was mighty, but whose hunger was mightier, the fall was swift. Not outwardly, no great cry, no battle, simply a crossing, from mortal man to wraith, from life to a half-life, from prince to servant. He could still act, still think, still command. But all of it was now filtered through a veil, and beyond that veil, Sauron waited, watching, whispering, owning, and there was no turning back. The transformation was complete when he first saw the world in shadow, not metaphorically, but truly. His eyes, now spectral, saw into the realm of spirits. The world of the living faded in color and texture. The warmth of the sun, the taste of wine, the sound of laughter, all became distant, like echoes from a life he had not lived. He had become a ring wraith, but not just any. The others, kings and warlords, sorcerers and tyrants, had faded too. But he stood apart, stronger, sharper, more attuned to the darkness, more willing to wield it. And so Sauron crowned him, the Lord of the Nazgûl, the Black Captain, the Witch-King. A title not given, but earned, through pride, through ambition, through the sacrifice of everything that had once made him human. From now on, he would walk cloaked in terror. And even when unseen, the air would grow still around him. The hearts of men would falter, and beasts would flee at his passing. And yet, somewhere, deep beneath that crown of dread, perhaps a flicker of the man still remained. But if so, it was buried beneath centuries of servitude, trapped in a place where neither light nor memory could reach. This is the price of power offered too freely. This is the fate of those who seek to master death. If you've followed the Witch King this far, you already know this is no mere villain. This is a mirror, a warning, a prophecy, and the further we walk, the darker the path becomes. Stay with us, subscribe to Realms Unravelled, and continue this journey through shadow and flame. Because in Chapter 4, we will rise with him, as he builds a kingdom not of stone, but of fear, a frozen throne for a king of nothing and everything. Chapter 4. The Crown of Angmar. The man was gone. What remained was something else, something hollow, something eternal. But where most wraiths wandered the shadows, bound to Sauron's will, and little else, he rose above them, not in defiance, not in rebellion, but in mastery of the darkness he now served. For while the others faded into obscurity, he became a force, and every force needs a kingdom. He traveled north, far from the great wars of the southern lands, far from the white towers of the west. There, in the cold and bitter reaches of Middle-earth, he founded a realm of his own, a place as lifeless as the soul he had surrendered. Angmar. It was not carved with brick or stone. It was built with dread, with whispers, with silence. A land where no bird sang, where no leaf turned green, where winter seemed never to end. And at the heart of it stood Khan Dûm, a fortress more like a tomb, black-walled and cruel, cut into the side of the mountains of Angmar like a scar. This was his throne, not granted, but claimed. Here, the Witch King ruled not as a steward of Sauron, but as a king in his own right. Though his will still answered the Dark Lord, he wore his crown as more than a servant. He wore it as a sovereign, and from that icy throne he looked southward, to Arnor, the northern kingdom of the Dunedain, heirs of Númenor. Proud, splintered, weakening, their line, once royal, now fractured into petty rivalries and thin-blooded lords. He saw their disunity, and he smiled. For though he had left mortality behind, he had not forgotten envy. The blood that once flowed through his veins remembered the pride of Númenor, and if he could no longer claim its light, he would extinguish it from the world. So he waged war, not with thunderous armies at first, but with poison, with fear, with lies. The kings of Arnor fell not by blade, but by doubt. He sowed unrest. He corrupted their allies. He sent wights into the Barrow Downs, twisted spirits that whispered madness into the ears of those who strayed too far from safety. He turned men against each other, a silent war fought in council halls and empty corridors. And when the kingdoms finally broke, when Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor stood apart, each guarding its own throne, the Witch King struck. Rudor fell first, its rulers replaced with men loyal not to their people, but to the Black Tower in the north. Cardolan was overrun, its tombs filled with the dead, and the not quite dead. Arthedain resisted longest. The true heirs of Isildur held the line, wielding swords forged in older fires, guided by the wisdom of the elves. But the Witch King's war was not one of conquest. It was a long defeat. One by one, the towers of Arnor went dark. Cities became ruins, forests became graveyards, and as centuries passed, the kingdom of the north faded, not in battle, but in memory. By the time the Witch King was done, the line of kings was broken. Only scattered chieftains remained, hidden among the wilds, their blood noble, but their thrones long lost. The Witch King had claimed no crown of gold. He had claimed silence, oblivion. He did not want to be known. He wanted all others forgotten. And in this, he succeeded. The world would remember Gondor, the battles of the south, the riders of Rohan. But the great kingdom of the north, it would become a whisper, a line in a book, a broken sword in a museum. And the king who broke it? He watched from the shadows, crownless no longer. If you've walked with us this far, you know that this tale is not about monsters, but about the making of monsters, about the slow surrender of the self, in exchange for a dream that should never have been chased. Realms Unravelled exists to preserve stories like this before they vanish like the kingdoms of the north. Subscribe, and let the firelight of memory guide you through the long dark. Because in Chapter 5, we will leave the icy halls of Angmar and walk beside him as he returns to war, not for conquest, not for glory, but for the ring. Chapter 5, the hunt begins, centuries passed, but the Witch King did not slumber. He could not. Time for him had become a hollow thing, a wheel turning endlessly beneath his shadow. Seasons changed, empires rose and fell, and still he lingered, a spectre bound not to time, but to will. And then the whisper came, a whisper unlike any he had heard in long ages, thin, frail, uncertain, but unmistakable. The ring had surfaced, the one ring, Sauron's masterwork, long thought lost in the depths of the Anduin, had stirred once more. It called faintly but insistently from the west, and with that call, the Dark Lord's purpose ignited like dry tinder. His dominion, once shattered by Isildur's hand, could be reforged, but to reclaim the ring, he would need hunters, servants without mercy, creatures bound to his will and unmoved by fear. He would need the Nine, and foremost among them stood the Witch King. He did not ask. He did not question. His will was not his own to doubt. When the command came, he obeyed, not as a dog obeys its master, but as a sword obeys the hand that wields it. He rose from the shadows of Minas Morgul, the city he had claimed and defiled. Once known as Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, it had been a place of beauty. Now it bled green light and poison. Now it echoed with cries that were never answered. And from its gates, the Nazgûl rode, not in armor, not in pageantry, but unclad, unseen by mortal eyes, their very presence thinning the air around them. Across the Anduin they passed, across the plains of Númenórean and into the Vold, where even beasts shied from their approach. For though they were invisible, their terror was not. It clung to them like a cloak, not of fabric, but of fear. Trees wilted at their passing. Waters grew still. Dreams turned to nightmares in the villages they passed unseen. Their mission was simple: find the Ringbearer. But their leader, the Witch King, knew this would not be simple. The ring was cunning. It wanted to be found, but not by just anyone. It longed for a master, yes, but it feared him too, and it would resist, even as it lured. In the lands of the Shire, the Nazgûl sought their prey. They questioned, they hunted, they sniffed the air like wolves. Frodo Baggins, the bearer of the ring, fled before them, aided by unlikely allies, hindered by fate and fear. And then upon the hill of Weathertop, the Witch King struck. There, beneath moonlight and flame, he raised his cursed blade, a Morgul knife, forged with spells of binding and decay. With it, he aimed not to kill, but to break, to leave the Ringbearer alive, but wounded, marked, slowly drawn into the shadow, where he would surrender the ring willingly. The blow landed, Frodo was pierced, but the deed was not done. Aragorn came, flame in hand, voice defiant, and drove the Nazgûl back. And though they could not die, they were scattered. The Witch King, first among them, withdrew, not in fear, but in fury. He had failed, and he would not forget. There is a weight to failure when one serves a master like Sauron. Not all punishments are given openly. Some are withheld: trust, favor, strength. The Witch King had been the first to fall into shadow. But if he proved unworthy, he could be replaced. So he bided his time, watched, learned, and waited. The next time he met the Ringbearer, there would be no retreat. The next time, he would bring war. If this tale stirs something in you, not just curiosity, but that ancient ache to understand the great tides that shape worlds, Realms Unravelled welcomes you. Subscribe and walk with us through the ruins of time, through the eyes of kings and wraiths alike. Because in Chapter 6, the Witch King will ride to his final hour, to a battlefield prophesied in song and shadow, where even death would bow before him, until it did not. Chapter 6. The Shadow That Fell. It ends where all dark roads end, not in triumph, but in silence. The Witch King had waited long. He had chased whispers through time. He had shattered kingdoms, slain kings, hunted the ring across mountain and mire. And now, at the twilight of all things, he rode once more to war. This time, he would not hunt in secret. He would not creep, nor hide, nor whisper. He would come as a storm. The war for the ring had begun, and the skies over Middle-earth darkened in answer. From Minas Morgul, his fortress of sorrow, the Witch King rode at the head of Sauron's armies, a black tide of orcs and beasts, siege towers and flame. His standard flew high, a crown upon a hilt, pale and empty. The white city of Minas Tirith stood in his path, and behind its walls, hope waited. The siege began with fire. The city shook beneath the blows of monstrous engines. Walls cracked, flames rose. The cries of the dying filled the night air, and atop a fell beast, wings wide as sails, the Witch King soared, not as a man, not even as a wraith, but as doom incarnate, and none could stand before him. When he landed within the city's walls, bearing a mace forged of cruel iron, even the bravest defenders faltered. He crushed warriors without pause. Shields split like bark. Hope recoiled until one stood. A woman, Eowyn of Rohan, fair and fierce, clad in armor and secrecy. Beside her, Meriadoc Brandybuck, small and uncounted, a hobbit among heroes. Together, they faced the terror the world had named unkillable. For prophecy had long foretold, not by the hand of man shall he fall. And so he laughed when she stood against him. But prophecy is a sharp-edged thing. "I am no man," she cried. And with that cry, she became more than mortal. She became a moment that echoed against fate itself. Merry struck from behind, his blade piercing the unseen world. The Witch King faltered, and Eowyn, the shield maiden, the unnoticed, drove her sword through the void where his crown should have been. And he fell. Not in fire, not in glory, he fell in silence. For the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgûl, the Shadow of the North, the Terror of Ages, had met the one thing he had never considered, an end. And perhaps, in that final moment, something ancient stirred in the darkness where his soul once was. A flicker of what he had been, a man, a lord, a seeker, a fool. But if so, it did not linger. There was no redemption, no last words, no buried name to be spoken in honor, only dust blown away on the wind. And thus ended the longest shadow in the Third Age, not by might nor by fear, but by courage and by the quiet defiance of those who should have never mattered. So what do we take from this? That evil is not born, it is chosen, and even the mightiest can fall, not in fire and wrath, but by a whisper, a promise, a ring offered too easily. If you've walked with us through all 6 chapters, you now know the truth. The Witch King was not a monster, he was a mirror. And if you wish to continue uncovering the buried legends of Middle-earth, the ones whispered by torchlight, the ones the bards never finished, Realms Unravelled will be here. Subscribe and let the story never end. Until then, walk in light, and remember, even shadows, no matter how long, must eventually pass.